Welcome to Sysinternals at 25. I am super excited to be here. I got Mark Russinovich with me. How you doing, my friend?
Doing great, Seth.
Legal driver and cheap insurance now for Sysinternals. Is that right?
Yeah, it's great. It's grown up. It's all grown up.
So I want you to get into the history of Sysinternals, because my understanding is, because I did a lot of research, I read the Wikipedia page yesterday, that it's changed names over the year. Tell us about the history.
Well, so I've always been interested in operating system internals and then writing tools to explore it and to take advantage of that kind of knowledge. I started to do that in high school, and then I went to undergrad, went to get my PhD in computer engineering and met somebody named Bryce Cogswell, who becomes key to the story in a few minutes. But we started working on products as part of a startup that we came up with idea that involved leveraging Windows internals, both Windows 93.1, Windows 95, and Windows NT. And so I started to learn about internals, and then I said, hey, I can actually understand better the way the operating system works by writing some tools that will show me what's going on. And the first tool that I wrote that did that was something called Regmon, Registry Monitor. And started to say, hey, Bryce, hey, we can write more of these kinds of tools. And so we started writing more tools like that. FileMon followed that. NTFS DOS is a tool that we wrote that runs actually on DOS, but lets you mount NTFS volumes that were created by Windows NT. And we started to continue making these kinds of little utilities. We decided, hey, let's publish these. So I had a friend named Andrew Schulman who wrote this book on undocumented Windows 95 that was really popular at the time. Made him unpopular with Microsoft.
Right.
But I'd gotten to know him, and I said, hey, you've got a website, how about if you post these tools up for us? And so we started to do that, and then I'd say, here's an update, and he'd say, okay, I'll get around to it, and a few weeks would go by and he wouldn't post it, and so I'm like, okay, we need to take this into our own hands. Bryce, let's put up a website, and so we put up mtinternals.com and started publishing the tools there directly. And so that was September of '96 when we launched that domain, mtinternals.com, and started publishing the tools, and we launched with 4 or 5 tools that we developed over that year leading up to that.
So let me ask you a question. So basically this was born out of a curiosity for the internals of an operating system. You're like, I'm gonna write some things to visualize. Obviously the registry was a scary place back then where you don't want to change stuff, and you visualize certain things to help you and decided to release it.
Yeah, I mean, it was really kind of fun because I love the multi-purpose aspect of things that I do where I'm getting multiple uses out of it. In this case, I was learning about the operating system, just writing the tool. And then the tool itself would teach me more about it, and then other people would find it useful too.
And so there was a bunch of tools, like you mentioned just a couple of them. Tell me, what were some of your favorite ones to work on that you learned the most from?
Well, Regmon and FileMon were both fun because they both showed operating system internals, but took 2 different approaches. On FileMon, Windows had this built-in system for intercepting file IOs that antivirus drivers would use. But there was no example for how do you monitor what's going on. And the documentation for it was pretty lame. At the time, there's something called the IFS Developers Kit, Installable File System Developers Kit, which didn't really talk about doing filter drivers, as they were called, very well. So I had to reverse engineer a lot and experiment a lot to get that running. But it leveraged mostly, documented, kind of semi-documented Windows APIs to do what it was doing. For Regmon, there was no here's how you intercept registry calls. Working on my PhD at Carnegie Mellon, I'd come up with something for Unix of patching the system call table. For example, when you call open file or the open API, it goes into the kernel, and then the kernel through a index, and the open function in the kernel is called through that index. And if you replace that index with a different function, then the kernel will call that function instead. And if you record where it was originally pointing, the original open call, you could point it at yours, do some stuff, call the original one, get back what the result was, and then return. This is called system call hooking. And so I did that for Unix, and then I'm like, I can do this for Windows too. And so I came up with system call hooking for Windows NT to develop Regmon for it. So 2 different approaches, and required me to be a little creative about how I could get that kind of visibility into the operating system.
So you were doing some crazy pointer arithmetic then for the system calls as they were going to the kernel.
Yeah,
is that right?
That's right.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
I took an operating system class. I didn't know I had 24 hours 26 hours in a day to write operating system code because it was that bad. How deep did you have to get into things to make this work? Because you're looking at the system call table, which is literally how things happen in the kernel.
Yeah, so a lot of this stuff wasn't documented, of course, because it's so low level and no reason to document it for the average developer. So I did a lot of reverse engineering. And I reverse engineer it a couple ways. One is I would have a kernel debugger, and it's kind of ironic because I started to use this tool called SoftIce, which had debuggers for DOS and then Windows 95, Windows 3.1, Windows 95, and Windows NT. I ended up joining the company that made that, New Mega Technologies. But that's the tool that I used, and I actually wrote some APIs for it and wrote documentation for it after I joined it. But that's the tool that I used to set breakpoints and then say, oh, the operating system is doing this, now it's doing that. And then I also used static analysis, where you can take the binaries and then disassemble them, which means translate them into assembly language. And then I could study that and also kind of get a view of where things were. And Windows, the kind of cool thing about Windows is it came with symbols, at least for what they call public symbols. So for kernel APIs that were public, that when somebody's debugging something would help them understand what's going on in the kernel, those symbols I could map into the disassembly. And then I could say, oh, here's the create function, and it's calling the allocate memory function, and it's, I could follow my way through the system that way.
So you're not just looking at jump calls and addresses, because that would be terrible.
The thing is, the private APIs didn't have symbols, so that I did a lot of that too. Of like, what is it called? What is this function doing? And then I'd give it my own name so I could track what it was going on. But
I remember when I did my operating system class, I asked my professor, hey, can I use C++? And he laughed at me. He's like, if you get it to work, great. So you were literally like in C and lower level code to get this to work, because there's no other way to do it.
Yeah, this is assembly language, which is, the low level CPU instructions just in a human readable form. It's not binary, but the next level up from that.
It's like move. This thing, address, jump, this thing, address, and it's that low level. Now, as you're debugging these things, are you actually jumping through the actual assembly?
Yep. And then you're looking at the register set, and you're looking at memory to see what changed. And
so we mentioned a couple of tools. Are there any tools that were inspired, other than looking at the system calls, where someone asked you for something, or you're like, oh, I have a really good idea about this, or any tools like that?
Where somebody asked me for something. Yeah. Well, actually, one came out of me and Dave Solomon teaching Windows internals classes together, which I started to do in the late 90s, and we co-authored this book actually together. I've got a little picture of it here.
Oh, nice.
The little story on this one, Dave wrote this book called Inside Windows NT. And second edition, after the Helen Custer famous Inside Windows NT that came out when NT did. And I looked at that book. I was going to do my own internals book, and I'm like, wow, he's just raised the bar so high. He had demo kind of samples and demos inside the text to illustrate concepts with tools that came in the NT resource kit. And I wanted to be a part of the next version of it. So I'm like, Dave, hey, how about letting me join as co-author? I can take some of the articles that I've written and incorporate those into the book, and then I can bring the Sysinternals tools in and add a whole lot of new experiments to the book. And there's some stuff that he had to negotiate with Microsoft that, related to some of the tools, because I'd pissed Microsoft off a little bit, and they're like, okay, fine, you can. The tools are on a CD on the book. But I started to teach Windows internals with him too, even including going to Microsoft. But one of the things that we would do is experiments live in the class, and on the screen. And the challenge was that you'd have to make the fonts super big, and there's some where you couldn't control. So it was really hard for people to see the demos a lot of times. So Dave had this tool that came with one of his pointers that on a laptop that will let you magnify stuff. And so we started to use that, and it was kind of clunky, like the hotkeys to magnify were clunky, and you couldn't do annotations very well in it. And so I'm like, after a couple of years, I'm like, this is obnoxious. I'm doing my own.
And you're talking about Zoom It.
Zoom It, yeah.
I use that thing religiously to this day. The other thing is that you were making these tools for free, but there was a moment in time where you decided there's got to be a way to monetize these things, and then there's a fun story on the way to Microsoft as well. Why don't you talk about that?
Well, so I was happy just writing these tools and making them free. Bryce had this idea for this tool that we ended up calling NT Recover. he's like, hey, what if we take one of the problems that we saw, even ourselves, in doing our stuff is you get the system into a state where it wouldn't boot. And like, how do you get data off that system that doesn't boot? How do you go fix it? And Bryce is like, what if we take the serial cable that we use for debugging and connect it between the two things and boot the dead machine off a floppy, and then have a program running on Windows NT that would mount that, have a driver that would make that remote disk look like it's a local disk, and then it would mount it, and then you could look at it, use all your favorite tools to recover data off it and fix it. And so we ended up writing that, and he's like, the recovery part's gold. We can sell that. So we decided, hey, let's start a company. And actually, I owe Bryce this basically, because he's the one that went and got the business license. He set up the e-commerce site. This is 1996 as well.
Yeah.
And then he started copying floppies. He got floppy machine copiers, and then went to the shipping place, and he'd answer tech support. Meanwhile, I was working at IBM at the time.
Yeah.
I'd already gone to IBM, so I was doing this in my spare time. But that's how Winternals got off the ground. And NT Recover, just in the first month, we sold $1,000 of it. In the second month, it was like $5,000, and it just kind of took off. And we were advertising the tool on Sysinternals and making a free read version. This is a shareware idea that we made on Sysinternals. So a year into that, and I was making enough money on the side from my IBM job that I was like, I've always wanted a Ferrari. I'm going to go buy a Ferrari, and so that's
really cool. And I have stories of, because my dad was a doctor, right? He's retired, and back in the day, he put all his medical records on some machines, and I turned them on and broke them, right? And he's like, well, you got to get that back, son. If I would have had a tool like that, it would have been a lot easier to do that. So tell me about like the move into Microsoft. Did they just bring all the tools in with you, or what was all that like? Because now your job is very different, obviously.
Yeah. So 2006, the acquisition happened, and it was an acquisition of both Sysinternals and Winternals. They're both independent legal entities. Sysinternals being free, Winternals being the commercial software company. We had 85 employees at the time. So acquisition of both and the technology of both. One of the things that I really was passionate about was keeping Sysinternals going. Mm-hmm. In fact, the day the acquisition is announced, Microsoft put up a blog post. We put up a thing on Winternals and Sysinternals saying Microsoft's acquired it, and there was a mad rush of people to download. Everybody go download. Microsoft's going to kill this, and so our web server crashed. That's what they did at the time.
Yeah, back in the day.
Yeah, so we had to keep it up and running, and we're like, no, don't, calm down. It's not going anywhere. But the Winternals tools became part of Microsoft Desktop and Recovery Toolkit, MS Dart, and part of our backup tool too, so Data Protection Manager. The Sysinternals tools, I was basically left, me and Bryce, both joined Microsoft, to continue working on them. And so we just did that and continued working on them in the spare time. We worked in Windows as day jobs, but the first tool that I wrote with Bryce after coming is Process Monitor, which is it's probably the most useful tool for troubleshooting. Yes. In fact, this is a slogan somebody came up with that Dave Solomon came up with it, actually, I think. We can't remember the quite origin of this, but when in doubt, before it was when in doubt, run FileMon and Regmon. Really, this was the combination of those two plus a whole lot more power. So that became T-shirts, and that became a thing. And we would say, when in doubt, I would get audiences to say in troubleshooting, case of then explain talks, when in doubt, and run Procmon.
Before we get into like the current state of the tools and the future, by the time, and I really want to dig into this, by the time people are using these kinds of tools, some pretty serious things have happened, right? Do you have some interesting stories of customers using these things and the reasons why? You don't have to give us names and dates or anything, but I'd love to hear some of the interesting stories from customers.
Well, there's just hundreds of examples of users using the tools to solve problems. And one of the things that became a slogan for Sysinternals and Winternals was "You saved my butt," or "You saved my,"
Yes.
And so we actually had Windturnals ad campaign that was, save your butt, kind of thing. But that was, so there's just hundreds, and I would incorporate them into the Case and Explain talks. But some of the most kind of funny ones were, one of the tools that I wrote was the blue screen screensaver that would, like a screensaver, when it was your system was idle, would draw a very realistic blue screen. And then I took it a step further. I'm like, I'm going to make it look like it's rebooting your machine too, with the Windows logo and the scroll, the progress bar is, and then it would crash again. It looked like it crashed again. And I'd have people that would run this on production machine, and then somebody would come by and be like, oh, this machine's crashing. I'm going to reset it, and then take down their production machine. Not the intended effect. And then people use it to play pranks. And there's a tool, one of the most popular tools, PS Exec, part of the PS tools, that lets you run things remotely. It's actually much better than PowerShell remoting. It is like the way to do remote desktop administration. I'm just poking Jeffrey Snover there.
We should. We have to. It's part of every interview.
Yes, it is. But PS Exec is still incredibly popular. But what people would do with PS Exec and the blue screen screensaver is run it on somebody else's machine, and then they would freak out and think their machine was crashing.
Oh my goodness, because back in the day, the machines were literally under people's desks, and if you push the button, like the web server would go down, kind of thing. Yeah. That's funny. Any other interesting stories or things that people used your tools for that you were surprised about?
Well, lots of tools like these, a tool is a tool, and it doesn't have any inherent goodness or badness,
right,
but
of course.
People can take a tool and use it for good purposes or bad ones. PS Exec is a prime example of this, actually, because a lot of hackers get on corporate networks and then spread through it, and the way that they spread is taking advantage of PS Exec. So PS Exec, countless, and still even today, you'll see security analysis of malware and infiltration into a corporate network, and and then they use PS Exec to jump from one machine to the other. So that was it kind of surprised me, I guess. I didn't kind of realize that it was going to be used that way, right. And then it was.
That's cool. Okay, so let's talk about now Sysinternals at Microsoft. There's a whole docs page with tons of different tools. One thing that I've always asked myself, and maybe you can answer this, maybe you can, is why aren't they part of Windows?
Yeah, that's a question that I get all the time, and I still see it on Twitter. It's like, why aren't these just built into Windows? One of the reasons that they're not built into Windows is Windows used to have a very slow ship cadence. And so that the rate of refresh on tools and bug fixes and feature additions, I didn't want to be constrained. So even, I was like, I need to keep these independent so that we can release them. And they go across lots of versions of Windows. In fact, the tools for a long time, up until probably 6 or 7 years ago, supported both Windows 95, no, maybe a little older than that, but Windows 95 as well as Windows NT. So it was the agility of the release that I didn't want impacted. But the other one is that the Windows bar is much higher than freeware toolbar.
Yes.
And it's like full support for SLAs with customers and customer support, and a lot of machinery goes into supporting a tool that is part of Windows from a legal perspective and from customer promise perspective. And I didn't want to have these things slowed down. I mean, obviously very popular with what we were doing, the kind of level of support and the kind of level of polish that we had on them, and I wanted to preserve that. So that's another reason that we kept them outside of being shipped in the box as Windows.
And that's interesting that you mentioned legal reasons, because if you're downloading these tools, you're taking some responsibility for what's going on, as opposed to, you have a EULA in Windows that promises and does certain things.
Yeah, and the EULA in Sysinternals is like, these are on, for your own use.
As is.
No
merchantability.
Exactly.
That's the word that we always read in our software. So another question, and maybe you can't answer this, but I'm going to ask it anyways. Why aren't these open sourced?
Another question that I get all the time. And on the Windows ones, one of the reasons that they're not open source is that a lot of them use undocumented APIs. So I mentioned, Regmon was one example up until it folded into Process Monitor, but Process Monitor also uses some undocumented APIs. And the reason not to make them open source is that effectively documents them. And once you document an API, you're also responsible for documentation and backward compatibility, and that would constrain in some ways the ability for the core of Windows to evolve, kind of inadvertently, right? If you don't do it deliberately, you're not going to be able to preserve those kinds of guarantees that customers expect out of documented APIs. So that's really the key reason. Now, some of them are tools that use fully documented APIs. And the reason I haven't open sourced them is that open sourcing actually takes some effort. Like if you're going to open source, you need to like embrace the spirit of open source, which is, I'm going to put this up. You can do pull requests on it. I'm going to look at your pull requests. I'm going to, so I was like, really it was more of, don't want to again burden the tools with that. And also not be worried about the line of which ones are using non-documented APIs, which ones are, kind of thing. So that's the reason for that. Now on the Linux side, we've taken it's Linux, it's open source. So there's some new Linux tools, and for those, we're starting just with those being completely open source.
And I was going to ask you about Linux, because all the way at the beginning, you mentioned that you did some things in Linux-style systems. Are we doing things with Linux-style systems now?
What do you mean we doing things?
Like for example, are Sysinternals tools going to work on Linux?
Yeah. So yes, Linux used at Microsoft. In Azure, it's exploded.
Yeah.
In fact, there's more cores running Linux, external cores running Linux than Windows cores in Azure. So hugely important for us to support Linux. And what I looked at is like a lot of these tools make sense on Linux. So one of the tools, the first one that we made a version for Linux, process dump, it's called proc dump. We said, hey, there's a good reason to have process dumping capability on Linux that uses triggers like process dump for Windows, and then you can control where the dumps go and the other capabilities that are part of that tool. And so we created proc dump for Linux. And proc dump for Windows is actually used inside of Azure's infrastructure. Proc dump for Linux is going to be used in Azure's infrastructure. So it's kind of one of these kind of core utilities that make sense in both operating system environments. And then we're excited to announce here at this event the release of Sysmon, which is a security monitoring tool that I wrote back in 2014 when John Lambert, who works in our threat intelligence group, writing tools and tracking hunt bad actors, came and called me up and say, hey, I need to come over and talk to you about something. It's like we've got a bad actor that we've seen on our network, and we need it'd be nice if we had a tool that would let us better track exactly what they're doing. And here's what it needs to do. Track processes, track files. They do this shredding thing where they drop a file, they use it, and then they delete it, and they shred it by overwriting it so that when we do forensics, we can't see what they ran. Like, it'd be cool if you could have the tool catch that. And I'm like, well, I've got a lot of that infrastructure already ready, in one of the tools, Process Monitor. So I could just start with that and probably have something for you pretty quickly. So 2 weeks later, I'm like, here's a tool that does what you wanted. And so he used it and found it effective. And then we said, hey, we should make this, can I make this in Sysinternals tool? And we said, yes. There's some capabilities that we'd like to be withheld from the public version for now, which are all now in the public version, like clipboard copy and this file shredding recovery. But that was Sysmon. And so that excited today to announce that Sysmon for Linux is out, which we've been talking about working on for a while. But it's, of course, a completely different implementation for Linux, but it has the same purpose. And one of the powerful aspects of Sysmon for Windows is its filtering capability that lets you say, I'm looking for this particular signature for malware. Let me write a configuration file that captures that. And that's something that there's no built-in tool in Windows or Linux to have that fine-grained filtering of what you want to capture with all the level of detail that you capture that is relevant to security analysis. And so that's built in with compatibility in the configuration file and the same kind of behavior as the Sysmon for Windows, now available for Linux.
So, future of Sysinternals. I mean, are you still writing? Are you literally going in there writing stuff still?
Yeah, I do.
Future.
Not nearly as much as I did. For example, one of the most recent things, I'll add little things every now and then, but I added to Sysmon, what was the last thing that I just added? It's hard for even me to remember. I added a feature to it just a few months ago. and
I bet it was awesome.
It was really
It was the best feature ever. You're not going to want to be without it.
I know. I remember what it was. So one of the hacker tools is to launch a process. It's called process. This technique is called process hollowing, where you launch a process like Notepad, and then the malware unloads Notepad and the Notepad executable from the process address space, and then loads in their malware.
Oh.
So when you look from the outside about what's happening, it's like Notepad's doing all this funky stuff,
yeah.
but it's not really Notepad. So I added a detection in process and Sysmon for detecting those techniques of process hollowing, and I did that a while ago. That's one of the most recent things. So I still do work on the tools, but now we've got a few other developers that are contributing to the tools. Including people that are working like Mario and Kevin Sheldrake, Thomas Garnier, who work on the Linux side of things as well, which I've also participated in the design of those as well. So I do still, have an active role in what the tools are and where they're going and what we should prioritize, and then throw in features every now and then. So
nobody should rush and try to download them all because they're going away. It's still active and there's still going to be stuff happening.
Oh yeah, for sure. In fact, so now we've got actually a few devs that are full-time on Sysinternals. Up until now, it was first me and Bryce, and then we hired somebody to kind of manage the website kind of operations things, and then we hired somebody else to help work on the tools. So now we've got a few people that are just full-time job. Let's keep the tools fresh. We try to shoot for a release of tools every month of something. So yeah.
I'm a fan. I mean, I've been using Zoomit forever. I use the, what was it, the Process Explorer?
Process Monitor.
Monitor, that one, to see which text file is holding up everything.
Yeah, Process Explorer.
Process Explorer, and I enjoy them thoroughly. Like I said, I've literally used it today, and I've used it like almost every day since. This has been super cool. Anything else you'd like to add? To finish up?
Well, one of the things, there's support you can get, like there's forums for Sysinternals, but one of the cool things is, and it's still a great reference, is this book that actually this is not the right version of it, but this book, this was the first book that I wrote with Aaron Margosis.
They finally let you write the book, not like the other one, right?
That's right. Yeah, this one, and that book, which is in the second edition, is called Troubleshooting with the Sysinternals Tools with Aaron Margosis, who's giving a talk here at the seminar, a couple talks at the seminar on a couple of the tools. Really is a fantastic, you really want to understand the tools and what to do with them, and it's got a bunch of case then explains. That is a great reference to help you get the most out of them.
And just from a pedagogical perspective, I wanted to use a $5 word here.
Yeah.
Using those tools gives you a really good sense of what's actually going on under the hood, which is super useful. And it's what got you excited about these things in the first place, right?
That's right. Yeah. No, I mean, it's just been, they've had a huge impact on my life, obviously. Just the knowledge I've got out of them, the enjoyment I've got out of I mean, I still today, I'll go visit a customer, and they'll come, or they go to the EBC, and a customer will come in and be like, "This Sysinternals tools, man, those are so awesome." Or I used them 10 years ago, and my career has been so much better because of those tools. It's so rewarding to hear that.
All right, so here's a question that I've had. What makes a tool a Sysinternals tool? There's got to be some bar, right?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I believed from the start of, if I'm going to use a tool, I don't want to install it. I just want to use it. And so that was a principle from the very first tool is I can just copy it someplace and use it, which is kind of the Linux philosophy, Unix philosophy. And I'd actually come from working a lot on Unix. The other one is that it shouldn't leave any stuff behind. So they clean up after themselves and try to not to leave anything behind on your system. And a third one is, in general, this isn't 100% true. I didn't want to have to write manuals and documentation for them, and I wanted them to be very straightforward and kind of self-explanatory and intuitive to use. And so that's been another key goal of the tools is no manual required. You can run the tool and kind of figure out your way around it pretty quickly.
It's funny you should say that because I'm not even kidding. I have on Windows C:util on my path, and I literally download the system and I just put them in there.
Yeah.
And then I just call it, right?
Yeah.
And that's actually pretty cool because I've seen that and I didn't know that was a philosophy. Okay.
Oh, by the way, speaking of that, that's another announcement for today. They're now in the Windows Store, so you can install them. They will go into your Start menu, and they will also be accessible through shortcuts from the command prompt. So they'll always be kept up to date. So that's another thing that we're doing today.
That's actually pretty useful because every once in a while I was like, I should probably change my util directory with the newest ones.
Yeah.
So that's a really cool thing. Now, another question that I've had, because there's so many tools and I've seen a lot of them, sometimes I get a little overwhelmed myself.
Yeah.
Which ones are the indispensable ones that people should try out?
Yeah, well, I think just going through the most popular ones will get you basically that list. Auto runs, which will show you what's configured to start and run on your system automatically. So if you want to go get off the crap that's popping up when you log in and figure out how to get rid of it because you still like the thing, but you don't like it popping up, or you're going after malware hunting, auto runs. Process Explorer to understand what's actually running and find out who's got the
fan here.
Yeah, who's got the open file. Process Monitor, so number one tool for troubleshooting. Zoom It I use Zoom It myself to zoom in on text on my screen when it's too small.
Yeah.
And rather than having to change my fonts and DPI, I'll just zoom in. You can also get screen clips very quickly from it, like zoom in on something and do Control S or Control C. And
I did not know that.
Yeah,
that's cool.
Little undocumented tip, or it's documented, but little tip there for you. So I'd say that those are the big ones. And then if you're working in security, Sysmon, which is a security monitoring tool, logging tool.
Well, awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for spending some time with us, Mark. And thank you so much for watching. Sysinternals is now 25 years old and hopefully many years to come. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in a little bit.